With that as a background, talking about foundations, let's go to Genesis chapter 4. In Genesis chapter 4, we've talked about the fact that Genesis is a foundational book for a lot of reasons, but Genesis is a great book for foundations of the family because the whole book is simply a story of families. It's a story of families and the events connected with family life. Genesis chapter 4. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, and this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of the sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought forth an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry? And why is your countenance fallen? And if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. Now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth. And Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth. And it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me. And the Lord said to him, Therefore whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begot Mehujael, and Mehujael begot Methushael, and Methushael begot Lamech. Then Lamech took for himself 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, the name of the second was Zillah. And Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the harp and flute. And as for Zillah, she also bore Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in iron, in bronze and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Then Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. Wives of Lamech, listen to my speech. For I have killed a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 70-fold. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. For God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord. This is the story of the first family right on the heels of the Garden of Eden. Sound like it was a happy family? I don't think so. It didn't take but one generation to go from eating forbidden fruit to fratricide. One brother murdering another. I'm sure that created some real dilemmas at the dinner table. Anybody here ever have conflict in your family? Anybody here ever have arguments between husbands and wives? Anybody here ever have conflict between parents and children? Anybody here ever have any differences of opinion in your family setting? I assume the silence is a resounding yes. I hope it hasn't escalated to the point of fratricide. Very well could have. But if it did, you're not the first. What I'd like for us to discover today is what we can learn from Genesis 4, not only about the presence of conflict, but hopefully we can learn from Genesis 4 great truths from God's Word, how to address and resolve and even prevent conflict in the family. Now, I want to say as a prelude and even to preclude the rest of the message that this is a subject that's near to my heart, and I'm sure you'll hear more about it as the year goes on. Because I believe that one of the greatest evidences of the breakdown of the nuclear family in our culture today is the lack of ability in our culture for people to resolve conflict. Now, what do I mean by that? Even in the church, one of the things that if I ever wrote a book, if I ever got time to write a book, I think I'd write a book on the subject of church hoppers in America. Any pastor you talk to will tell you, and experience has been that in the typical American church, there are people that move from church to church to church, and reasons are unknown much of the time, but in my opinion, illegitimate most of the time. There may be legitimate reasons, but most aren't. And what do I mean by that? Well, here's what I say why I say that's evidence of lack of conflict resolution skills and the breakdown of the family. Is that what happens is people will get into a relationship and they'll come to a church and they'll stay at that church until they have conflict with somebody. And their resolution and their response to that, because they are petrified at that notion because they have no capacity to cope with conflict. They have no skills for that. It is a foreign object to them, and they don't even know how to begin to approach it. So their response is to run from it. So their response when conflict arises is just get mad, take their ball, and go home. And they go to another church. And guess what? You're at that church a while, guess what happens? Let me give you a news break. Anytime you're in a relationship with people at any level, there are going to be differences of opinion. Conflict is inevitable. And what happens is same pattern over and over again. And they end up their entire life running from church to church or from relationship to relationship because they have no capacity to resolve conflict. And I believe that the primary reason for that is, according to Jay Kessler, former president of Youth for Christ International and president of Taylor University, as he had worked with students his entire career. And he said, what I have noticed is that the greatest skill that parents can impart to their children is conflict resolution skills. Because what I see most needed in the lives of students with whom I work is the ability to resolve conflicts, because they've never been in a close relationship with anybody that had the ability to do that on a regular basis, and therefore they have no skill in that area at all. And therefore they have no long-term relationships. And I believe that the dismantlement of the nuclear family in America has created an entire generation of people who don't know how to get along with each other. And it permeates our culture. If you don't believe it, just look at talk radio or news shows on television. Nobody has any ability to resolve conflicts because they don't have a model for that. And that insight was first imparted to me through a man far wiser than myself, a colleague who was a second career minister. He had been a high school teacher his entire career, had gone into ministry as a second career. And he had an outreach to students who were in risky, marginalized situations. And he told me, he said, I've learned a great truth working with these young people. He said, I would approach these young people, try to build a relationship, and I would invite them to come to church with me on Sunday afternoons for a Bible study or a program at 5 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. And none of them would come. He said, I finally learned that what I needed to do was invite them to come, and I would say this. I would always clearly put parameters on it. He said, I would say, would you come and study the Bible with me for 5 weeks? And I would limit it to that. He said they would come. And he said it occurred to me, and I learned that it was like a revelation, that the reason for that is that these students had never been in a relationship in their life where anybody had ever made an unconditional commitment to them. Ever. Nor had they ever seen it modeled in their home. Therefore, they had no capacity to process it with anybody else. No capacity. And so he said, in order to begin to have inroads in their life, I couldn't ask for an unconditional commitment to anything. And that is related to the issue of conflict resolution, because I believe that now, after several generations of the growing divorce rate and dismantlement of the family in America, I believe we have created a populace that by and large has no parameters for unconditional relationships and no conflict resolution skill. Therefore, we have no long-term relationships with anybody that matter by and large. Now, I got that off my chest. It's what I think. Think differently, that's fine. Free to do both. But I see that as a critical issue as I observe people and relationships beginning in the church. But the good news is Genesis 4 teaches us it's possible to reverse this process and this difficulty. Genesis 4, I believe, teaches us that. Now, I want you to bear with me just a second, and let me give you some context and perspective with regard to the Bible and translations of the Bible. We all know that the Bible wasn't written in English. The Bible was originally written, the Old Testament in Hebrew, the New Testament in Koine or Common Greek. And any English Bible we have is a result of Bible scholars taking those original documents, trying to figure out what the words said and meant, and rendering them as best possible into the English language to convey the original meaning. That's a very difficult and demanding process. Many are involved in similar things in mission work around the world. Some of us here even in our own congregation in that regard. Having said that, people ask me, what's your preferred Bible translation? Here's my answer, all of them. All of them. Say, well, why? Well, because no one Bible translation, I think, does an excellent job with every passage. Some have strengths, some have weaknesses, they all have different emphases. And so what I do as I study and prepare, as you may have noticed, those of you that are here on a regular basis, is in any given sermon, when I put scriptures on the screen on a given week, they might be from several different versions to relate that passage. Why? Because when I study a passage, I try to determine what is the best meaning of this passage from the original, and then find the English version that most effectively communicates that in a modern equivalency of the way you think and what words mean and what it means today. I've done this for years, simply because, like a guy told me one time, he says, "Which is the right Bible translation?" I said, "All of them, none of them. If you really want to get it right, read Hebrew and learn to read Hebrew and Greek, and then you can go straight to the source." So my point is that that's the reason we have to study. And that's relevant to this message today, because in Genesis 4:1, there is a typical rendering of that verse that is in most translations, which says, as mine does, Eve bore a son named Cain and said, "I've acquired a man from the Lord," which is an okay rendering. That's not off base in and of itself. But I don't think it really gets at the essence of what is being said there by Eve. Interestingly also is that some of your translations, depending on which Bible you might be reading, there are some English translations that will actually read it this way: "I have acquired a man with the help of the Lord." Now, the translations that are truly doing justice to that and letting you know what's behind those words in English will have the word help in italics. Now, what they're trying to do there is tip you off to let you know that that particular word is not in the original. It's added by the English translators to try to clarify what the original actually meant. But as I began to study this passage for this week's sermon, and I began to read what various Bible scholars had to say, and I began to look at the passage, I discovered something that was truly revolutionary about this passage. As I looked at evidence presented from the text, is that the way it's typically rendered or viewed is not necessarily getting at the real heart of what Eve says here in verse 1. So after I discovered that, I began to compare all the different English Bible translations I could get my hands on. And I found one particular English translation that absolutely nailed it. It happened to be the New English Translation, which is a recent translation that was done by the faculty at the Dallas Theological Seminary. And I want you to look at that particular verse in that translation, and let's read it together. "Now the man had marital relations with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. Then she said, 'I have created a man just as the Lord did.'" Whoa! Back up. What? Yeah. Now, how many of you would agree that's a radical statement? And without going into laborious detail, the point is, if you examine this and read the rationale by a lot of Bible scholars, this really carries weight, carries a lot of weight. But that having been said, notice the attitude that is exemplified in Eve at the birth of Cain. Now, furthermore, let's back up a minute and let's look at the rest of that chapter, and let's look at the result of Cain's life. Cain was the firstborn, so he was the favored child. And Eve's really proud of having him. You know, there's a difference between loving our kids and worshiping our kids. Parents. And Eve's really proud. What's the result? Abel does something that God says is better than Cain did it, and Cain can't take it. He's so envious, he can't share the platform with anybody. He's the firstborn. He's the one his mama was the proudest of. And so what's he do? He gets so mad and he's so infuriated that somebody has stolen his platform of favorite, and he kills his brother. And then he has kids. And we finally get down to the end of his kids, and we get to Lamech. Lamech has 2 wives, and you remember that Cain was not to be avenged by death. If anybody kills Cain, he'll be avenged. Well, look at what Lamech says. I've killed a man for wounding me. What? Even a young man for hurting me. Lamech is so arrogant, nobody's going to cross me. I'll kill people even if they look at me the wrong way. That's the result of Cain's progeny. That's the result of Eve's pride and joy and his life. That's an amazing, amazing heritage, isn't it? But then look at the contrast. And this contrast is there absolutely on purpose. This contrast is not an accident. If you look at verse 25, let's read verse 25 together. We've finished the story of Cain and his descendants and the result of his birth. Now Eve has another child. And look at the contrast here in her statement as compared to what she said when Cain was born. Read it with me. And Adam knew Eve, his wife, again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. For God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. And as for Seth, so was born a son, and he named him Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord. I want you to look at 2 things here. First of all, look at the difference in Eve's response to the birth of Seth as opposed to the birth of Cain. Look at what she says here. God has appointed another seed for me. God has given me another son. I see that very different than just like the Lord, I've created a man. I see those as 2 dramatically different responses to the birth of a son. I see a different Eve in verse 25 than I saw in verse 1. Furthermore, look at the results. Look at the consequences of the birth of Seth as contrasted to the birth of Cain. Cain's consequences were generations of people who were self-exalting, prideful, and vindictive, right? Look at the result of the birth of Seth. Not only Eve's response, which is humble and God-fearing, but look at his life. He had Enosh, and it's during that time, as a result of Enosh, that people began to call on the name of the Lord, that people turned to God. There was revival. And that's a dramatic contrast that's there to teach us a powerful lesson. Notice the dramatic change in Eve's characterization of the birth of Cain and the birth of Seth. Notice the result of Seth's descendant Enosh and his effect on people. And I would submit to you that based on what we can discover in this passage, that Eden didn't humble Eve, but Cain's murder of Abel did. She had an aha moment. That's not hard to figure out. If in anybody's family, if a parent has 2 siblings and one of them murders the other, I think it would be a wake-up call for any parent and a very humbling experience. Would you agree? You see, to put it in a contemporary vernacular in our modern churchese terminology, Eve had a come to Jesus party somewhere in chapter 4. She had a radical turnaround. And notice the result of her turnaround. You could summarize Eve's response as humility. Eve became a humble person. And Eve proves the power of humility. Eve proves the power of humility. The worst family conflict can be resolved if those in charge will humble themselves before God and their family, take responsibility for themselves and their actions, and change the way they behave toward others. Greatest definition I've heard in many years that's emblazoned on my mind is, I don't even know the guy's name who coined it, but he was right on. He said the difference between a boy and a man is a man takes responsibility for his actions. And the same could be said of a woman. You see, we have a lot of immature people running around today who give evidence of that because everything is everybody else's fault. Somebody else didn't do something they were supposed to do for me. And that's the reason I messed up. I'm not responsible for anything. Listen, as long as we have that attitude, we're not going to get anywhere with conflict resolution. You see, what Eve does is Eve proves the power of the teaching of Jesus. What does Jesus say in Matthew 7? One of the most powerful statements. By the way, Sermon on the Mount. The longer I live and the more I experience, I am always amazed at how relevant the Sermon on the Mount is to life. I have literally never found any significant question in life that I haven't found a principle or a truth from the Sermon on the Mount to apply to that and give me direction as to how to do what Jesus wants me to do. The Sermon on the Mount is a soup to nuts for life. It's the whole deal, A to Z. It's not surprising. Look who preached it. I think he knew something. And Eve proves the power of the teaching of Jesus. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye but do not consider the plank in your own eye, Jesus says? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite. First remove the plank from your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. I remember as a young pastor, I used to get really frustrated that church people weren't fired up about Jesus. I used to get really mad that people in the church weren't as committed as they need to be. I get really upset about that. And most of the time, I'd be really mad because of the people who weren't at church that Sunday instead of being thankful for the ones that were. Now, I'm still not completely over that, I'll confess to you. But I remember as a young, I'd get so frustrated with that. And all of a sudden it occurred to me, you know, you're going to live a miserable life if this is your criteria for happiness from this point on. Because you have absolutely zero control over any of that. But you've got 100% control over yourself and your walk with God and the state of your soul. So stop worrying about everybody else's and just be concerned about yours. And once you get where you need to be with God, then watch and see what God does with you in the life of other people. And it was a liberating moment for me when I realized that my main job was not to get the speck out of other people's eye, but make sure that my eye didn't have any logs in it. And once I got the logs out of my eye, then other people might even begin to see the speck in theirs. And I want to make sure and live my life in such a way that if people are uncomfortable with Jesus, they'll be uncomfortable with me. And you see, much of the time, the reason that we don't resolve... See what Eve, all of a sudden, it appears obvious that Eve at some point got the message. God gave me this child. This child is God's gift. And that attitude change created a change in her family. She got the log out of her eye, and everybody else's speck took care of itself. Eve proves the power of the family. Look at that, verse 26. And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then man began to call on the name of the Lord. Listen, Eve had revival in her life. It led to revival in her home, which led to spiritual renewal in the world. What's the key to turning this world around? It's turning families around. It's for the home to become a place of worship where Christ is Lord, which He always intended it to be. And the church is a secondary manifestation of that. And what's the key to that happening? You are the key. You are the key. And I want to tell you something, attitude is everything. You see, Eve had an attitude adjustment, and it led to revival in her home and spiritual renewal in the world, all because she changed her attitude. And I want to tell you that it's all about attitude. God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. We're saved by grace. That's an attitude. And I want to tell you, when we get our attitude right, God's going to use us to change not just our life, but those around us and the world. So the question is, you need an attitude check. I'm not talking about everybody else in your family, I'm talking about you. You need an attitude check. We all need attitude. We need the Holy Spirit to give us attitude checks. You know, just quick example, personal, this morning. You know, after you're married for 35 plus years, you just kind of do things. You know, they just kind of happen. And 99.9%, I do certain things. Now, I'm not just a couch potato. I do certain things. But my wife does many things. And one of the things that I have assumed that she does through the years, she does it far better than I, is she typically does the laundry. Now, that's not because I'm opposed to laundry, but she does better than me. I'll help her if she wants to. But it occurred to me this morning as I got up, for 35 plus years, I've never gotten up and not had something clean to put on. Now, that's a big deal. You know, I had never thought about that till this morning. Now, I know that says volumes about me. But that's an attitude. Right? She doesn't have to do that. I'm certainly not paying her. But I sure am glad to have clean underwear. What about you? Now, I'm not trying to be silly or trite, but isn't that where the rubber meets the road? Isn't that this is what I'm talking about? I don't know what, but whatever your attitude needs to change, if there's conflict, I'm not saying that your attitude's the cause, but just make sure it's not. Have the courage this morning to look in the mirror. Amen.